Africa has been underestimated for centuries, labeled as a continent of crisis, ignored, exploited, and divided. But that story is changing right now. In 2025, a quiet revolution began sweeping across Africa, not with guns, but with agreements. Not with chaos, but with coordination. For the first time in modern history, African nations are coming together, not as competitors, but as partners. And this alliance is worth $10 trillion. Imagine that. $10 trillion in oil, gas, gold, cobalt, lithium, and agricultural power, controlled, traded, and directed by Africa itself. From the cobalt mines of the Congo, to the oil fields of Nigeria, to Ethiopia's new industrial zones, to South Africa's BRICS connections, Africa is moving as one, and the world's superpowers are terrified. Because for the first time, the balance of global power is shifting south. And this time, Africa isn't asking for permission. Just a decade ago, headlines spoke of aid to Africa. Today, it's trade with Africa. Tomorrow, it will be dependence on Africa. Western governments, long accustomed to dictating terms, are suddenly finding themselves on the sidelines. The U.S. Treasury tracks African trade deals now with the same intensity it once reserved for China. European energy companies are begging for access to the very minerals they once took for granted. Why? Because Africa is taking control of what it owns and demanding its value. This isn't just an economic shift. It's a global awakening. In Niger, uranium exports, once sent cheaply to Europe, are being renegotiated under fairer terms. In Mali and Burkina Faso, leaders are rejecting Western military control and building regional defense alliances. In Congo, cobalt, the metal that powers every smartphone, every electric car, every laptop, is now a symbol of sovereignty. And when Congo said, "No more cheap deals," the world's tech giants panicked. From Tesla to Apple, factories in Silicon Valley depend on that cobalt. Without it, the batteries stop. Without Africa, the technology stops. And so, behind the scenes, the West is scrambling. Meetings in Washington, calls in Brussels, emergency conferences in Paris. They ask one question: how did Africa become this powerful? The answer lies in unity. In 2025, under the influence of the EES alliance, a coalition led by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, African leaders began forming a new framework for trade and sovereignty. A system where the continent's resources stay in African hands, where profits build African infrastructure, and where international partnerships happen on Africa's terms. From there, something extraordinary began. Countries that once operated alone began talking together. Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Kenya, Ghana, all aligning around a shared goal: economic independence. Then came investment, not from Europe, but from China, India, and even the UAE. Billions flowed into African manufacturing, ports, and renewable energy. Suddenly, Africa wasn't just exporting raw materials, it was exporting finished products. The numbers tell the story. Africa's combined GDP has surged past $4 trillion. Its projected growth? The fastest in the world. By 2030, experts predict that Africa will control 60% of the world's critical minerals, the very building blocks of the next industrial age. And when analysts saw that projection, panic rippled through Western markets. Because whoever controls those minerals controls the future. This is why major economies are quietly lobbying for new partnerships, even while pretending to ignore what's happening. Because they see the writing on the wall. Africa is no longer a supplier, it's a power. And this $10 trillion alliance is the proof. Imagine an Africa with its own trading bloc, its own payment system, its own satellite network, and its own defense pact. That's no longer imagination, it's happening. The African Continental Free Trade Area has already connected 1.4 billion people in the largest trade agreement since the WTO. BRICS nations are investing billions in local currencies. And across the continent, from the ports of Djibouti to the railways of Angola, infrastructure is booming. Western headlines call it a challenge, but Africans call it what it really is: freedom. For the first time, young Africans don't have to leave home to dream big. The factories are here. The startups are here. The innovation is here. This new Africa doesn't look to the West for permission. It looks to its own people for strength. And that's what terrifies the old powers most. Because this is not just about money. It's about control. It's about the end of an era where Africa's wealth fueled everyone's prosperity but its own. Now, the same cobalt, gold, and oil that built the West are building a new world with Africa at the center. And the message from African leaders is clear. If you want our resources, come as partners, not as masters. The West may have dominated the last century, but this century belongs to Africa. So as the world watches, one question echoes in every capital. How far will Africa go to protect its new power? And what will the West do when it realizes it can't stop it? Because this time, it's not just a movement. It's history, unfolding in real time. For decades, the world saw Africa as a continent to extract from, not to partner with. They came for gold. They came for oil. They came for diamonds and cobalt. And when they left debt, division, and dependency. But something changed. It started quietly, in boardrooms, in back channels, in late-night meetings between African leaders who were tired of the old order. They began to ask the same question. How can a continent so rich in resources be so poor in power? The answer was unity. From the deserts of Mali to the forests of Congo, a new movement took shape, built not on ideology, but on sovereignty. It was a call to every African leader. Control your resources. Protect your people. Build your future. And in 2024, that call became a plan. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso led the charge, forming the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a powerful regional bloc that stunned the West. Their goal was simple: create a self-sufficient African defense and economic system, one that no foreign power could manipulate. They began expelling foreign troops, renegotiating mining contracts, and redirecting profits into their own infrastructure and energy projects. Soon, others noticed. Ethiopia, fresh from building the $4 billion Grand Renaissance Dam, joined the momentum. Nigeria, with its vast oil and gas wealth, began exploring a continental energy partnership. And Congo, sitting on trillions in rare earth minerals, declared, "Our resources are not for sale, they are for Africa's development." One by one, the pieces began to connect. Suddenly, Africa wasn't just a collection of nations, it was a network powered by trade, technology, and trust. In Addis Ababa, the African Union accelerated talks on a continental energy grid, a plan to link power systems from Cairo to Cape Town. In Lagos, investors announced a Pan-African digital currency designed to reduce reliance on the US dollar. And in Johannesburg, discussions began to merge BRICS cooperation with the African Continental Free Trade Area, forming the backbone of a $10 trillion economy. This was no longer theory, it was transformation. And the world took notice. Reports from Western intelligence agencies warned that Africa's new unity could reshape global trade and energy flows. Think tanks in Washington and Paris released policy papers filled with quiet panic, because they understood the numbers. Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 60% of global arable land, and by 2050, it will have the largest workforce on Earth. For the first time in modern history, the very things the West depends on, cobalt for electric cars, lithium for batteries, uranium for energy, gold for financial security, are being consolidated under African control. That's why, when Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso announced joint mining companies to process their own gold and uranium, Western markets dipped overnight. The headlines were subtle. Africa rethinks partnerships, but behind closed doors, panic spread like wildfire. Because this was bigger than economics. It was a philosophical rebellion. For centuries, the Western world taught Africa that wealth comes from exporting raw materials. Now, Africa is saying no. Wealth comes from owning production. Factories are rising in Nairobi and Addis Ababa. Refineries are opening in Lagos and Luanda. And across the continent, governments are setting up sovereign wealth funds to keep African money in African hands. The results are staggering. African foreign investment inflows have surpassed $200 billion. Exports within Africa are up 35%. And new trade routes, connecting the Sahel to the Indian Ocean, are being built with African engineers, not foreign contractors. The message is clear. Africa is no longer waiting for help. It's building its own destiny. But not everyone is celebrating. In Europe, diplomats warn of a strategic setback. In Washington, Analysts call it the silent geopolitical shift. And in Paris, where French influence once dominated West Africa, policymakers are scrambling to maintain relevance. France's former colonies are turning away, demanding their gold reserves back, ending defense pacts, and nationalizing mines. The ripple effect is massive: billions lost in contracts, energy shortages in Europe, and a collapse of Western leverage. For the first time, it's the West that's reacting to Africa, not the other way around. And this is only the beginning. Because the $10 trillion alliance is not just about economics. It's about identity. It's about reclaiming a stolen narrative. In speeches across the continent, leaders echo one phrase: never again will Africa's wealth build foreign empires. Crowds erupt in applause. Flags wave. The energy feels electric. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, a generation that once looked outward is now looking inward, rediscovering what Africa truly is, the heart of the world's future. The alliance is expanding, slowly, deliberately, and with purpose. More nations are expected to join. More agreements are being signed behind the scenes. And as the global media begins to take notice, the world is waking up to a new reality. The global order is shifting, and its center of gravity is moving southward. Africa's time isn't coming. It's here.
In Washington, a quiet tension fills the air. In Paris, the unease is louder, almost desperate. And in Brussels, officials meet behind closed doors, searching for answers they can't seem to find. The unthinkable has happened. Africa, the continent they once saw as dependent, is now calling the shots. For decades, Western powers built their strength on African resources: cobalt for their tech, oil for their industries, gold for their banks, and uranium for their energy. They didn't just trade with Africa, they controlled it. But now, those foundations are shaking. When the Alliance of Sahel states announced their joint resource policy, banning the cheap export of key minerals, global markets trembled. Prices for cobalt and uranium spiked overnight. Tech companies scrambled to find new suppliers. And for the first time, Western nations realized that their energy and tech empires were built on fragile ground. Reports from Silicon Valley described it as an existential crisis. Without African cobalt, production of electric cars, smartphones, and military batteries could grind to a halt within months. For an industry worth trillions, this was a nightmare. Meanwhile, Europe was facing another disaster, with Africa redirecting energy exports to BRICS nations and local markets. European refineries struggled to stay afloat. France, once a dominant power in West Africa, was forced to reopen old negotiations, this time from a position of weakness. Gone were the days when African nations waited for Western approval. Now, it was the West knocking on Africa's door. In one striking moment, during a global energy forum, an African minister stood before European officials and said calmly, "We have sold our resources cheaply for 60 years. That era is over. From now on, Africa will decide the price of its wealth." The room fell silent, because deep down, everyone knew he was right. Western corporations tried to resist. They sent lobbyists. They pushed for sanctions. They even tried to fund alternative projects in other continents. But it didn't work, because you can't replace Africa. Not when it holds over 60% of the world's most critical minerals, the metals that power everything from AI to renewable energy. Not when it's becoming the food basket of the planet, with vast fertile lands and growing agricultural exports. And not when 1.4 billion people are rising into the global middle class, creating one of the largest consumer markets in the world. For the West, this wasn't just an economic loss, it was a loss of control. Every decade before, Africa's narrative was written elsewhere. But this new Africa was writing its own story, and the world had no choice but to read it. At the United Nations, African leaders began speaking with one voice. They demanded permanent seats on the Security Council. They pushed for fair trade, not charity. And they rejected the double standards of international politics. When Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré declared that Africa must end dependency once and for all, millions across the continent cheered. But in Western capitals, analysts called it dangerous nationalism. To them, Africa's rise wasn't progress, it was a threat. Because every step Africa takes toward independence means one less lever of control for the West. The US tried to respond. They sent envoys. They promised partnerships, aid, and investment. But the problem wasn't money, it was trust. Africa remembered the decades of one-sided deals, the military bases, the interference in elections, the broken promises. And so, Africa turned east, to China, India, and Russia, where deals were made on equal terms, with respect for sovereignty. China poured billions into African infrastructure, railways, ports, and digital networks. India launched technology exchanges and agricultural projects. Even the Gulf states began investing heavily, buying into Africa's energy and logistics sectors. The West watched, powerless, as the balance of power shifted. A U.S. senator was quoted saying privately, "We've lost Africa. And when you lose Africa, you lose the future." That statement was never meant to go public, but it spread online, fueling a global conversation. People began asking, how could a continent so underestimated become so essential so fast? The answer was simple. Africa stopped waiting for help and started helping itself. By forming regional alliances, pooling resources, and negotiating as a single voice, Africa transformed from a divided continent into an economic superbloc. And this transformation exposed something the world never wanted to admit, that Africa was always powerful. It was just never allowed to realize it. Now, the same nations that once dictated to Africa are the ones begging for new trade deals. The same banks that once lent Africa money are the ones seeking African investment. And the same governments that once looked down on Africa are now looking up in disbelief. In Europe, energy ministers warn of an unavoidable crisis. In the U.S., tech CEOs meet behind closed doors, strategizing how to secure rare minerals before it's too late. And across Africa, leaders smile, because they know this is just the beginning. The rise of Africa is no longer a slogan. It's a reality that the world must face. And as the dust settles, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The 21st century will not belong to those who conquered Africa. It will belong to those who stand with it.
Welcome to African Spotlight 24, your premier source for news and current affairs from across the continent. We're glad you're here. If you're new to our channel, please subscribe, like, and turn on notification to stay up to date with the latest news and analysis. Your support helps us reach more people. Disclaimer: the content of this video is based on credible, publicly available information and is intended for educational, analytical, and informational purposes only. African Spotlight 24 does not promote hate, violence, misinformation, or political unrest. Our goal is to deliver thoughtful insights, highlight local voices, and encourage informed conversations throughout Africa.